Sci-Fi Fridays podcast. Here, you'll be listening to science fiction stories infused with powerful themes relevant to today's world. I'm your host, Allie Anderson, and I'll be reading original stories that I have written myself. Episodes will be released every Friday. Today's episode is called Friend of a Friend. Sage Water stared outside the window of her family's car as the driver bot drove down the small town of Scandium's main road. The town was so tiny they had only one main road and only a couple grocery stores. It was the most miserable place for Sage to be right now. In the front seat beside the driver bot, her dad flipped around to look Sage in the eye. "You're going to be fine, Sage. It's common for new students to arrive at schools every day." Sage shrugged. "Yeah, but it's not common for me to be at a new school." She folded her arms. In her old town, Breeze, they had huge shopping malls and road bridges that stretched across the city. It had taken her forever to make friends with some of the most popular kids at her old school. Now she was practically friendless at a new school and didn't even know where to start. Her dad seemed to be searching for something on his phone, then pointed the screen at Sage. "Look, there's even a famous girl here at your new school. Maybe you should make friends with her." On the screen, Sage saw a girl grinning and holding a golden trophy shaped like a vintage robot. "Her name is Patty Hart. She won nationals in robotics for her school last year." Her dad continued scrolling through the article. "Oh yeah, that's not nerdy at all." "Hey, I thought robotics was supposed to be cool among kids now. Now that it's more part of their lives now than ever." He gestured to the driver bot. "Isn't that right, Rover?" He grinned at the bot. When Sage was little, she named the robot Rover. Now it just embarrassed Sage whenever one of her parents called him that. Sage looked away from her dad and out the window as the driver bot pulled up to the Scandium Middle School. Even the school was small. As soon as the car was close enough to the curb, Sage grabbed her backpack and jumped out of the car. She leaned in the door so she could see her dad. "Thanks for the ride, Dad." Her dad nodded. "Have fun." Sage turned around and began walking toward the school's front doors. She wasn't quite sure that she'd have fun, but she figured it was better to hurry and not be late for class. As she walked through the doors, students swarmed in the hall, talking and laughing together. She looked around for the school's main office. After walking around a couple minutes, she finally found it and walked in. A giant egg-shaped robot secretary was sitting in the office. "How may I help you?" Her soothing voice was slightly too loud for the quiet office. "I'm Sage Waters. I transferred here from the Breeze Middle School." Sage leaned back on her heels as she waited for the robot to process. "Thank you for checking in, Sage. Your first class is with Mrs. Lawson in room 124. Your schedule has been printed out." Some papers spat out of the robot's internal printer. Sage bent to pick them up. "Thank you." She left the room and began heading toward her first class. So far, she hadn't decided if she liked the fact that no one had noticed her yet or not. At this stage, she decided that this was a good thing. There weren't many students seated in the classroom yet, so Sage quickly found a seat off to the side of the room, then sat down. She set her backpack beside her and waited for the teacher to arrive. A couple girls talking to each other came into the classroom and made a beeline for what Sage assumed must have been the seat that they always sat in. Sage recognized one of the girls almost immediately. Her dad had shown Sage a picture of her. Her name was Patty. Sage also remembered her dad had encouraged her to be friends with this Patty. Maybe she could work up the nerve to actually talk to anyone. Before long, a tall lady with bright red hair and glasses that looked like cat eyes walked into the room. It must be Mrs. Lawson, who was supposed to be the teacher of this class. As more students streamed into the classroom and practically filled the room, Sage felt more lonely than ever. Each student seemed to have at least a couple friends to talk to. Sage fiddled with the edge of her desk while she waited for Mrs. Lawson to begin the lesson. "Before we start our fascinating studies in science today, class, I'd like to announce and welcome a new student. Dear, could you please stand up and tell us your name and something about yourself?" That was the last thing Sage wanted to do. Why did Mrs. Lawson have to point out the fact that this was Sage's first day? Reluctantly, Sage shrugged and stood up. "My name is Sage Waters, and I like to play soccer." As soon as she finished, she plopped back down in her seat. Mrs. Lawson nodded at Sage, but Sage avoided looking at her. She'd rather get no attention right now than any attention at all. The rest of the school day went by like an average school day. Sage missed all her friends in her old school. She also missed when pretty much all the students in her class thought she was cool. At this school, she felt invisible. At lunch, she stood in line for food with at least half the students in the cafeteria. While the other students around her talked to each other and around her, Sage just stood quietly. Finally, after she got her food, she looked around the tables to find a seat. There weren't very many there, and they seemed to be mostly taken up. Across the room, she spotted Patty with her friend again. Patty's friend caught Sage's eye, then turned to Patty. Sage wasn't sure if that was an invitation or not, so she decided to find a seat at a different table. There was an empty table at the back of the room. She walked over to that table and sat down after putting her lunch tray down. Just as Sage began to eat, Patty's friend came over. She smiled in a way that made Sage want to smile back. "Hi, I'm Catherine. Do you mind if I sit here?" Catherine didn't have her lunch with her. Sage hoped she wasn't going to ask for any of hers. Sure." With a smile, Catherine sat down. "You're Sage, right?" Sage nodded, picking up a fork from her lunch tray. Catherine was quiet for a moment, then turned to Sage. "Do you have any hobbies or activities that you like to do?" Sage shrugged. "I don't know. I did like soccer for a while, but I haven't really done much of it lately." When she lived in Breeze, her friends had told her that she had to choose between soccer or sit alone during lunch. Sage hated to be alone, so she was always doing whatever her friends were doing. "Oh." Sage continued eating her lunch, not sure what else to say. They sat in silence as Sage ate. Before long, she finished her lunch and stood up to put it away. "I'd better get going." Catherine nodded. "Okay, see you later." The rest of the day went by rather slowly, and without anything of interest to Sage. She could care less about why Scandium's first settlers named it after the metal that they mined it from here. That evening, Sage and her parents sat down to eat dinner. Their table was the only thing cleared from the army of boxes around them. "So how was school today, Sage?" Sage's mom handed a bowl of greens to her. "It was okay. This town is small, so there wasn't much excitement." Sage dumped some greens on her plate, then passed the bowl to her dad. "Did you get to meet that girl who won the robotics competition?" Her dad passed Sage a plate of meatless meat, then took the greens. "No." Sage put some meat on her plate beside her greens. "I still really miss my friends from Breeze." "Who do you miss? Maybe we could schedule a meetup somewhere." Her mom handed her a plate of assorted vegetables. Sage took the veggies and thought a moment. "I don't know. I guess I just miss doing things with all of them. There's not really a specific person that I knew very well." "Well, maybe you should try some new hobbies now. Like robotics. I can bring you to my workshop at Bits and Pieces and teach you the basics." Sage shrugged. "Maybe. I kind of wish I knew someone around here to do an activity with." "Did you meet anyone at school?" Her mom picked up her fork and put a bite in her mouth. Sage nodded. "I actually did. There was this girl named Catherine, and we talked a little bit today." "You should ask her if she'd like to go to your dad's workshop with you sometime." "I like that. That's a good idea." Sage picked up her own fork and began eating. Her dad smiled. "We can go over this weekend." "Sounds good." Sage put another bite in her mouth. Scandium sure wasn't like Breeze, but it was turning out to be a little better than she expected. The next day, as Sage entered the classroom for her first class of the day, Catherine caught her eye. She gestured for Sage to sit next to her. "Good morning." Catherine grinned at Sage. Sage sat down in the chair beside her. "Morning." Catherine gestured to the spot Catherine was sitting in. "Normally, my friend Patty would sit here, but she's unusually late today, so she won't mind that you sit here. She can sit in this other spot beside me when she comes." Catherine pointed to the seat on the other side of her. Sage nodded, not sure how else to respond. They sat in silence for a while as Sage tried to think of what to say. She wasn't sure what she should say to Catherine next. This was the first time someone had actually gone out of their way to be her friend. Was that what a real friend would do? Sage had always called the girls in the group she was a part of back at Breeze her friends, but all they tried to do was make Sage do whatever they were doing. Catherine spoke up before Sage had a chance to say anything. "Why did you move here?" "For my dad's job." Catherine leaned on her desk. "Really? Who does your dad work for?" "He works for a technology company called Bits and Pieces Tech." "I don't know much about it, though." "Oh, my uncle works for them. He made this." She pulled out a phone and held it up to show Sage. "Nice." Sage wasn't sure how to react, since she knew nothing about technology. "They're letting me and Patty beta test them." Catherine shrugged. Patty's gotten hers to work out just fine, but mine doesn't really want to do anything at all. Before Sage could figure out what to say next, Mrs. Lawson came in and began the lesson. Half a minute later, Patty rushed in. Her hair was wet and she looked like she'd ran all the way to school. Mrs. Lawson gave Patty a stern look. Now, Patty, you know better than to be late for class. Punctuality is an important skill to learn while you are young. It will help you in high school and when you get a job. Patty didn't seem to be listening as she headed for an open seat. Sorry, she mumbled. The rest of the class continued on like usual, except Patty's phone kept going off in the middle of class. Sage was thankful that didn't happen to her on her first day. Right before the next class, Sage heard someone call her name over the loudspeaker. Catherine turned to her questioningly, but Sage shrugged it off. There was probably just some mix-up of paperwork or something. Quickly, she headed for the middle school's main office that she'd come to yesterday when she checked in. This time, the principal was standing there with the robot secretary. The principal was slightly taller than Sage and had her blonde hair in a nice-looking ponytail. She had her arms folded at the robot secretary but relaxed when she saw Sage. You must be Sage. I am Principal Adams. It has come to my attention that I did not have the opportunity to meet you yesterday on your first day here. I apologize. Sage nodded. It's all right. It must be pretty easy to lose track of all the students. Sage left out the fact that this school was only a fraction of the one she was used to. That's not the only reason I called you here. I need you to sign a couple things. Principal Adams gestured to the desk in front of the robot secretary where a few papers were laid out. Then, we need your parents to sign this one. She handed Sage another paper. Sage took the paper, then quickly signed the others on the desk. When she was finished, Principal Adams smiled. Perfect. Now you should scoot to your class before I make you late. Sage nodded and left the office, half running to her class. By the time she reached it, the classroom was pretty packed with students. She spotted an empty seat toward the back and headed toward it. Before she could see what was happening, she accidentally tripped over someone's backpack. Sorry! She quickly picked it up. She had to do a double take at the student whose backpack she tripped over. It was Patty. Patty gave her an annoyed look. It's fine. Sage could tell that it was most definitely not fine, but decided to let her be. By lunchtime, Sage hurried through the lunch line to get lunch, then walked over to the table where Catherine was already seated. Sage set her lunch tray on the table and sat down beside Catherine. At that moment, Sage spotted Patty rushing over to them. Catherine grinned. Hi, Patty. Come sit down. Patty sat on the other side of Catherine. Listen, I've been thinking. Today has been a pretty awful day. But it showed me some things that I wasn't seeing before. I'm sorry I've been such a bad friend to you. I should have listened to you when you wanted to talk to me yesterday. It just looked like you and Sage were having so much fun and that you decided to replace me. Patty fidgeted with the edge of her shirt sleeve. Will you forgive me? Sage almost laughed. Her and Catherine had been hanging out together a bit, but it was pretty awkward for a while. Catherine smiled. Of course I forgive you, Patty. You are my closest friend and I never want to replace you. She turned to Sage. I'd never replace you either, Sage. Have you met Patty yet? Sage looked over at Patty. Maybe Patty wasn't as bad as she had been expecting. She smiled. I think we've bumped into each other before. She stopped herself. Or I've bumped into her backpack before. Patty laughed. It's nice to meet you too, Sage. She leaned on the table. So where are you from? I moved here from Breeze. Sage moved over a little so she could see both Patty and Catherine. Catherine and Patty exchanged an impressed look. Patty was the first to speak. Wow, what was it like to be there? It was different. For the last couple days, I'd been missing my old friends back at the Breeze Middle School. But now, she looked from Catherine to Patty, smiling. Now, I don't really miss them that much. In fact, I wish we'd moved sooner. Catherine nodded. So do I. The end. Thank you so much for listening to the second episode in the Sci-Fi Fridays podcast, Friend of a Friend. If you'd like to receive weekly updates on when the newest episode is released, head on over to allieanderson.com and subscribe to my email list. All emails are written by and sent from me, and any replies you send to my emails will go directly to my own inbox. Now for today's question of the day. What is one everyday job that you think a program could be a robot could be programmed to do. Any ideas to this question of the day just might be used in one of my future stories, so don't be a stranger and feel free to respond to any of my questions of the day. You can answer the question of the day using the link in the description or type in the link allieanderson.com/sci-fi-fridays-friend of a friend. Until next Friday, this is Allie Anderson signing off.